This is a great one, eh? This is why I grind. This is why I work. This is why I hustle. In case anybody's wondering why. Why do you do this? Why do you do what you do? Why are you putting these videos out? Why are you trying to help so many people? To honor the sacrifices others have made for me. It's very simple. That's my why. Now, a lot of people have a difficult time understanding the difference between a traditional deadlift and a Romanian deadlift. Let's say one is for the back or full body and the other one is for the hamstrings. But if you want to know the effect that any exercise is going to have on your muscles, you got to understand the biomechanics of the movement, and you got to understand how muscles operate. You got to look at a movement and say, at what point is the force required to overcome the resistance going to be greatest? And we'll know this because of biomechanics. And what relative length are the muscles in at that position? So if we look at the deadlift and the Romanian deadlift, what are the major joints in motion? The hip. With the deadlift, there's flexion of the knee. With the Romanian deadlift, the knee position remains relatively constant. It's in a fixed position for the most part. Now, that's very important because that dramatically will influence the effect that the exercise has. And here's why. When you descend into the deadlift and you bend at the hip and you bend at the knee, what's happening? If the hip and the knee are the major players here, what muscles act on those joints? So on the hip, you got the glute is responsible for extension of the hip, and the medial hamstrings, we'll just say the hamstrings, is responsible for extension of the hip. 3 out of the 4 quad heads are exclusively responsible for extension of the knee. So we'll just say the quad. The quad is responsible for extension of the knee. Now, what levers do these muscles act on? What bones do they move? The quad acts on the shin, so it extends the knee, and the shin is the lever that's in motion. The shin is parallel to the direction of resistance when you do a deadlift, or at least you want it to be. Therefore, it's inactive. The lever is inactive. So the muscles acting on that lever do not have to do much work to promote movement in that movement. They do need to produce force, however, to stabilize the joint, to stabilize the knee, so that other muscles can contribute to producing the force to overcome the resistance and promote movement. But they don't need to promote actual movement itself. The shin lever doesn't move. So we got 2 other levers. We got the thigh and we got the torso. And we're not going to talk about every single spinal segment as its own lever. We'll just say the torso as a whole. So what muscles act on those levers? The glutes and the hamstrings. Therefore, we could classify the deadlift as a glute and hamstring dominant movement. Now, the muscle that is stretched the most is generally recruited the most. So if we look at the hip, what's happening as you descend into a deadlift is you're stretching the glute. The glute is responsible for extension of the hip, so when you flex the hip, you're stretching the glute. The hamstring makes things challenging to understand because what's happening is at the hip, we're lengthening the hamstring, but since it crosses the knee and you bend at the knee, we're shortening it at the knee. So the relative length of the hamstring remains pretty much unchanged. We lengthen at the hip and we shorten at the knee. Same relative length. Now, a muscle's capacity to produce force is at its highest when it's at or near its mid-range. So when you perform a deadlift, the muscles that move the bones, the levers, are the glutes and the hamstrings. The glutes goes into a more stretched position, but the hamstrings do not. Their capacity to produce force remains very, very high. So how does this compare to the Romanian deadlift? So what we have in the Romanian deadlift, the quads do the same job. They act to produce force to extend the knee and move the shin lever, which is parallel to the direction of resistance. It's inactive, so the quads don't have to do much. If we look at the hip again, though, what we'll see is flexion of the hip, lengthening of the glute, lengthening of the hamstring, but at the knee, because there's no flexion in the knee, or it's very little, not much bend at all, what's happening now is as we lengthen the hamstring at the hip, we do not shorten it at the knee. So its relative length is now longer in comparison with a traditional deadlift. Remember, the muscle that's stretched the most is generally recruited the most. So now the hamstrings are in a more stretched position. In one lift, they're not stretched. Their capacity to produce force remains very, very high. And in the other lift, they are stretched. So what's happening here, if we look at the biomechanics, in the bottom position of a deadlift, the thigh bone is pretty much perpendicular to the direction of resistance. So the muscles acting on that lever have to do the most amount of work to overcome it. And the hamstrings are in a position of advantage at that position. The glutes are in a bit of a disadvantaged position, but the hamstrings can produce a lot of force there. With the Romanian deadlift, what you'll see is there's flexion of the hips, so the torso lever is pretty much perpendicular to the direction of resistance. So the muscles acting on that lever, so the muscles, same muscles acting on both levers, the torso and the thigh, as it relates to the deadlift. The only difference is in one lift, the thigh is the most active lever, and in the other one, the torso is the most active lever, but it's the same muscles acting on it. So the Romanian deadlift, when you flex at the hip, you're stretching the glute and you're stretching the hamstring. So now, as the lever becomes most active and the force required to overcome the movement is at its highest, one of the major players, the hamstring, is no longer in a position of advantage. Its capacity to produce force is lower because it's not at or near its mid-range anymore. It's in a more lengthened position. So as the movement becomes hardest to do, the muscles involved in the movement are in a weaker position. So they have to do even more work to overcome the resistance. So that's the difference between the two. With the deadlift, the hamstring's relative length remains unchanged. Its capacity to produce force is very, very high. Therefore, you can deadlift more than you can stiff leg deadlift or Romanian deadlift because the hamstrings go into a position of disadvantage when the resistance is at its highest. So that's the difference between the two. If you understand, like I said, biomechanics, when's the movement going to be hardest to do, and how muscles operate, what relative length are they at when the movement is hardest to do. It's not that one exercise is a back exercise or full body and the other one's for the hamstrings. It just has to do with biomechanics and how muscles operate. It's the same muscles involved in the lifts. At what position, though, is the resistance greatest to overcome, and what relative length is the primary muscle group in at that position? And then you understand what that exercise is to target, what it's for. You like this information, feel free to share it. Click the fucking button at the bottom, subscribe to the channel. I'll keep bringing you the best information as it relates to training to build muscle and get stronger you're going to find anywhere. So you understand exactly what the fuck you're doing, why the fuck you're doing it, so you can maximize your return on investment of time and effort. Remember, you're going to the gym anyways. You're putting time and effort in anyways. If you want to maximize your return on investment of time and effort, you're going to want to know what the fuck you're doing. Because if you don't, you're simply throwing darts in the dark. Good luck hitting the fucking bullseye with that one.